The day King Aldric banished Lady Elian, the snow began to fall before the castle gates had even closed behind her. The old women watching from the marketplace would later whisper that winter itself had bowed its head in sorrow. The soldiers standing along the stone walls never spoke of it, but many remembered how the wind suddenly changed, carrying away the king's final command until only silence remained. She was allowed to keep nothing except the heavy wool cloak resting across her shoulders. Not her horse. Not her satchel. Not the silver pendant her late mother had left her. Not even the small leather journal where she had spent years writing remedies for injured animals and herbs gathered from the royal forest. Everything was taken. Everything except the cloak. It hung around her like the last memory of a life that no longer existed. Behind her, the iron gates groaned shut with a sound that echoed across the frozen valley. No one called her name. No one asked the king to reconsider. Even the people who loved her lowered their eyes, knowing that speaking for an exile often meant sharing the same fate. Elian never looked back. If she had, she might have seen regret hidden behind a few tearful faces. She might have seen one young stable boy quietly wiping his eyes against his sleeve. She might even have seen King Aldric watching from the highest balcony, his expression unreadable beneath a crown that suddenly seemed far heavier than gold should ever feel. But she kept walking, one slow step after another, toward the white mountains, toward the endless forest, toward a future no one could imagine. She believed she had lost everything. She had no way of knowing that before the first night ended, 5 tiny cries beneath the roots of a fallen pine would change not only her life, but the fate of 2 kingdoms. Far beyond the northern peaks, another king searched desperately for something far more precious than treasure. Not gold. Not land. Not power. 5 missing wolf pups whose blood carried a promise older than every crown still standing. Neither ruler knew that destiny had already chosen its guardian. And she wore nothing except a worn grey cloak. Long before anyone called her an exile, Lady Elian had become known throughout the kingdom of Ashenhold for something few nobles considered worthy of praise. She remembered names. Not only the names of lords and ladies who crowded the royal court, but the names of shepherds living in distant hills, children selling apples beside the southern bridge, and elderly widows whose cottages leaned beneath old oak trees. Whenever the royal carriage travelled through villages, Elian always asked the driver to stop. Sometimes she bought bread from tired bakers. Sometimes she helped lift sacks of grain after a harvest. Sometimes she simply listened. The people noticed. Kindness spread through a kingdom much faster than royal decrees ever could. Children smiled whenever they saw the blue embroidery stitched along the sleeves of her traveling dress. Old farmers removed their caps with genuine respect. Even the stray dogs waiting beside market stalls wagged their tails whenever she passed. She never ignored them. More than once she had been seen kneeling in the mud, wrapping a wounded paw with strips torn from her own handkerchief while nobles walked past pretending not to notice. To Elian, suffering had never depended on titles. Pain sounded the same whether it came from a child, a horse, or a frightened wolf caught inside a hunter's trap. That belief made common people love her. It also made dangerous men resent her. Among them stood Lord Varric. Tall, perfectly dressed, always smiling. The kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He had spent years climbing through the royal court one carefully planned step at a time. Every alliance had a price. Every favor created another debt. Every conversation became another opportunity to gather secrets. Where Elian earned loyalty through compassion, Varric collected obedience through fear. He understood something many rulers forgot. A frightened king was easier to control than a confident one. King Aldric had not always been fearful. When he first inherited the throne after his father's death, people believed peace would finally return to Ashenhold. He was thoughtful, patient, honorable, but ruling changed him. Each passing year brought another failed harvest, another border dispute, another rumor of spies from the northern kingdom ruled by King Rowan. Little by little, doubt settled inside him like frost creeping across glass. Whenever uncertainty appeared, Lord Varric always seemed ready with answers. They grow stronger beyond the mountains. The northern king gathers allies. Someone inside these walls feeds him information. Those whispers continued until suspicion became easier to believe than trust. Even then, Elian never imagined those whispers would someday point toward her. The accusation arrived without warning. She had spent the afternoon helping the royal healer care for an exhausted mare that had nearly collapsed after carrying messages through heavy snow. Its breathing had finally steadied when palace guards entered the stable. Their armor clinked softly as they approached. Captain Rowan, an aging commander whose face carried more scars than pride, removed his helmet before speaking. "My lady." His voice almost broke. "The king requests your presence." She smiled gently. "Then we should not keep him waiting." She wiped straw from her hands before following the guards toward the great hall. The castle corridors felt strangely empty. Servants stepped aside without meeting her eyes. Two ladies of the court whispered behind jeweled fans. Somewhere above, ravens circled the highest towers. The air itself felt heavy. When the enormous doors opened, every noble already stood inside. No music played. No fire crackled loudly enough to soften the silence. King Aldric sat upon the stone throne carved with ancient wolves whose faces had almost disappeared beneath centuries of wear. Lord Varric stood beside him. Waiting. Elian bowed. "You sent for me, your majesty." The king did not answer immediately. His fingers rested tightly against the carved arm of his throne. Finally he spoke. "You have been accused of treason." The words drifted through the hall like cold smoke. No one moved. No one breathed. Elian slowly raised her head. "Treason." Lord Varric stepped forward carrying several folded letters sealed with broken wax. "Our patrols intercepted messages intended for the Northern Kingdom." He unfolded one dramatically. "They contain information regarding supply routes, border defenses, and royal movements." Elian frowned. "I have never seen those letters." "You expect this court to believe that?" His voice echoed sharply. "Witnesses claim you frequently disappear into the royal forests without escort." "I gather herbs." "For whom?" "The healers." "Or northern spies?" A murmur spread through the hall. Elian looked toward the king. "You know why I enter those woods?" Aldric's gaze never lifted from the letters. "The evidence is troubling." "There is no evidence. There are witnesses." Witnesses chosen by him. For the first time Varric allowed irritation to flicker across his face before replacing it with another polished smile. How unfortunate that innocence always blames others. Elian took one careful step forward. "Your Majesty, have I ever betrayed your trust?" Silence. Another step. "When the fever spread through East Hollow, who remained there until every child recovered?" No answer. "When wolves attacked the western farms, who organized food after the livestock were lost?" Still nothing. "I have served this kingdom all my life." King Aldric finally lifted his eyes. For a single heartbreaking moment she thought she saw uncertainty. Then fear won. "The risk is too great." Her heart seemed to stop. "I cannot allow even the possibility of betrayal." "So you choose suspicion over truth?" Pain crossed his face. "Only briefly. I choose the safety of my people." Lord Varric lowered his head respectfully. "A difficult but wise decision, Your Majesty." Elian understood everything in that moment. The trial had ended before she entered the hall. The letters. The witnesses. The accusations. All of it had been prepared long ago. She simply happened to arrive last. King Aldric rose slowly from the throne. "Lady Elian." His voice sounded older than it had that morning. "You are stripped of your title and lands." Each word landed like falling stone. "You will leave Ashenhold before sunset. You may take only the cloak you currently wear. Nothing else. Not a coin. Not a keepsake. Not even the remedies she had spent years collecting for those who depended upon them." Captain Rowan closed his eyes for a moment before stepping forward with visible reluctance. "My lady." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I am sorry." Elian offered him the faintest smile. "It is not your burden to carry." She unclasped the silver pendant around her neck and placed it gently upon the palace floor. Then she removed the ring bearing her family crest. One by one, every symbol of the life she had known. At last she turned toward the towering doors. No tears fell. Not because her heart did not ache, but because some grief ran too deep to reach the eyes. Outside, snowflakes drifted across the castle courtyard, settling quietly over the stones as if trying to soften the path ahead. The gates opened. A freezing wind rushed through the narrow passage. Elian pulled the heavy cloak tighter around herself and stepped beyond the walls. Behind her, the gates closed with a thunderous boom. Ahead stretched the white wilderness of Frostveil Forest. By nightfall, she would hear a sound so small that most travelers would mistake it for the wind. 5 tiny cries waiting beneath a fallen pine. And without realizing it, she would take her first step toward a destiny no king could ever command. The road disappeared before the daylight did. Snow drifted across the narrow mountain path until every footprint Elian left behind vanished within moments, as though the kingdom itself wished to erase every sign that she had ever belonged there. The wind rushed between dark pines, carrying the sharp scent of frozen earth and evergreen resin. Every breath stung her lungs. Her fingers, hidden beneath the thick folds of her cloak, had already begun to lose feeling. She did not know where she would sleep. She only knew she had to keep walking. The last village stood many miles behind her now, its warm chimneys hidden beyond the white hills. Ahead stretched Frostveil Forest, a place children heard about in whispered bedtime stories. Hunters spoke of it carefully. Travelers crossed themselves before entering its shadow. Not because monsters lived there. Because the forest remembered things that kingdoms had forgotten. As evening settled over the mountains, the trees grew taller, their branches weaving together until only ribbons of grey light reached the snowy ground. Ravens called from somewhere high above, then suddenly fell silent. The silence felt strange. Not empty. Waiting. Elian paused beside a frozen stream and knelt to drink through a small crack where moving water still whispered beneath the ice. The water was painfully cold, but it eased the dryness in her throat. She looked at her reflection. Snow rested in her dark hair. Her cheeks had turned pale from the cold. The woman staring back no longer looked like a noble. She looked like another wanderer trying to survive the night. She smiled sadly. So this is who I am now. The stream answered only with its quiet song beneath the ice. Darkness came quickly. The first stars appeared above the forest, glittering between moving clouds. Elian searched for shelter, but every rocky overhang already lay buried beneath deep snow. Fallen branches snapped beneath her boots as she climbed a gentle hillside covered with old pines. Then she heard it. A tiny sound. So faint she almost mistook it for the wind. A weak, trembling cry. She froze. The sound came again. Not from above. From somewhere beneath the snow. She turned slowly, listening. Another cry answered. Then another. Small. Fragile. Desperate. Her heart tightened. She pushed aside heavy branches until she reached a great pine that had fallen during some forgotten storm. Its roots rose from the earth like giant fingers wrapped around a hollow beneath the trunk. The cries came from inside. Elian dropped to her knees. With bare hands she began pulling away snow packed against the roots. Ice scraped beneath her fingernails. Sharp stones tore the skin across her fingers. She ignored the pain. The opening grew wider. Inside the hollow lay a great white she-wolf. Her thick fur was dusted with snow. Her amber eyes stared upward without movement. The cold had already claimed her. Curled tightly against her silent body were 5 tiny wolf pups. They were barely larger than rabbits. Their soft white fur trembled violently. One was too weak to cry at all. Another blindly pushed against its mother's neck, searching for warmth that would never return. Elian covered her mouth. Oh! For several long seconds she simply knelt there. The forest around her had become perfectly still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then the smallest pup lifted its tiny head and let out one broken whimper. That sound shattered every thought of walking away. She gently touched the mother wolf's shoulder. The body was stiff beneath the snow. There was nothing left to save. But there were still 5 small hearts beating. Elian slipped off her cloak. The icy air struck her immediately, stealing what little warmth remained. One by one she lifted the pups. Each weighed almost nothing. Their tiny paws were freezing. Their noses were cold against her hands. The weakest pup barely moved. She tucked them carefully inside the thick wool folds of her cloak, wrapping the fabric tightly around them until only 5 tiny noses peeked through. Instantly the pups pressed against one another. Small bodies seeking warmth. Seeking life. Elian looked once more at the mother wolf. Snow had already begun covering her peaceful face. "I promise," she whispered. "I'll keep them alive." She gathered stones despite her trembling hands. It took nearly an hour. The frozen ground refused to move, but she managed to build a simple cairn above the fallen wolf. Not a grave worthy of a queen, but enough that scavengers would leave her in peace. When she finished, she bowed her head. Then she stood. The pups stirred beneath her cloak. One tiny paw pushed gently against her chest. She smiled through tears that finally came. "I suppose it's the 6 of us now." The night grew bitter. Without her cloak wrapped around herself, the cold bit deeply into her shoulders. She hugged the pups close while searching desperately for shelter. At last she found a narrow crack between 2 enormous boulders where the wind could not reach them directly. She gathered dry pine needles beneath an overhanging ledge. Then she searched for fallen branches. Starting a fire proved harder. Her fingers had become clumsy. Twice the flint slipped from her hands. 3 times the sparks died in the snow. Finally, after what felt like forever, a tiny flame caught inside a nest of dry moss. She breathed gently. The fire grew. Orange light danced across the rocks. Warmth slowly returned. The pups whimpered softly. Elian opened the cloak. 5 little faces blinked toward the firelight. Their blue eyes had only just begun to open. One clumsily crawled across her lap before tumbling onto its side. Another yawned so widely its tiny pink tongue curled upward. Despite everything she had lost that day, she laughed. Only once. Only softly. But it was the first hopeful sound the mountains had heard since sunset. Morning arrived beneath silver clouds. The pups woke hungry. Very hungry. Elian's smile faded. She had no milk. No food. No idea how newborn wolves survived without their mother. She searched every memory she possessed from helping injured animals across the kingdom. Goat's milk. Rabbit broth. Soft fish. Anything. But she had nothing. The nearest village lay far behind her. Returning meant certain arrest. Staying meant watching the pups slowly weaken. She refused both choices. Instead, she carried them deeper into the forest. Perhaps somewhere there would be food. By midday she reached a stream where moving water cut through the ice. Fish flashed beneath the surface. She had never hunted before. Still, she sharpened a fallen branch into a crude spear. Her first attempt failed. The second frightened every fish away. The third left her soaked to the knees. She shivered violently. The pups cried from beneath the cloak. "I'm trying," she whispered with an embarrassed smile. "I'm truly trying." Hours passed. At last, one fish darted too close. The spear struck. Not cleanly. Not skillfully. But enough. Elian pulled the struggling trout onto the snow. Her hands shook with relief. She built another small fire beside the stream. Carefully she cooked the fish. Using the tip of a carved stick, she mashed the soft flesh into tiny pieces mixed with warm water. The pups did not understand at first. Then the boldest one licked the mixture. Soon all 5 crowded together, tiny tails wiggling furiously as they ate. Only the smallest remained weak. Elian lifted it gently into her hands. "Come on, little one." She dipped her fingertip into the warm broth. A tiny pink tongue touched her skin. Then another. Slowly, the smallest pup swallowed. Life returned to its eyes. Elian closed hers in silent gratitude. She had fed them. Only for today. Tomorrow would bring another challenge. But today, they had survived. That evening, as the fire crackled beneath towering pines, Elian felt something. Not heard. Not seen. Felt. The strange certainty that she was no longer alone. She slowly lifted her head. Beyond the firelight. Between the trees. A pair of golden eyes watched her. Then another. Then another. Massive white wolves stood silently among the shadows. Their thick winter coats shimmered beneath the moonlight like fresh snow. None growled. None bared their teeth. They simply watched. The largest stepped forward. Its shoulders reached nearly to Elian's chest. Old scars crossed its muzzle. Its pale eyes never left hers. Elian remained perfectly still. The pups stirred beneath her cloak. The great wolf lowered its head slightly. Its nose lifted into the air. It breathed deeply, as though recognizing something impossible. For one endless moment, woman and wolf simply looked at one another across the fire. Then, without warning, the giant wolf turned. One by one, the others followed. Within seconds they disappeared into the darkness as silently as drifting snow. Only their footprints remained. Elian stared after them. "What were you trying to tell me?" The forest offered no answer. Only the wind sighed gently through the pines. Far away, beyond the northern mountains, bronze war horns echoed across the valleys. King Rowan's finest trackers had entered Frostveil. But they were not the only ones searching. Elsewhere, beneath the banner of Ashenhold, Lord Varric smiled as his own hunters rode toward the forest. He had learned that someone had survived the attack on the wolf den. And he intended to make certain. No witness ever reached another sunrise. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of weathered steel. The small fire outside Elian's shelter had burned down to glowing embers, sending thin threads of smoke into the silent forest. Frost coated every pine needle until the trees shimmered like glass beneath the first pale light. Somewhere high above, a lone eagle circled the mountains before disappearing behind drifting clouds. The 5 wolf pups were already awake. They tumbled over one another inside the folds of her cloak, no longer as weak as they had been 2 days before. Their tiny paws pressed against her arm as they searched for food, their little noses twitching at every unfamiliar scent the morning carried. The smallest one had changed the most. The frail pup that had barely lifted its head now leaned clumsily against her wrist, blinking bright blue eyes filled with quiet determination. Elian smiled. "You've decided you're not giving up." The tiny wolf answered by licking her finger. She laughed softly. The sound disappeared into the trees. For the first time since leaving the castle, Hope felt warmer than the fire beside her. Not because life had become easier. Because she was no longer walking only for herself. She gathered fresh snow into a small pot carved from birch bark and warmed it over the fire until it became clear water. Another trout from the stream became breakfast for the growing pups. They ate eagerly. The boldest pup always pushed ahead first. Another waited patiently until the others had finished. One preferred curling against Elian's knee rather than eating immediately. Each already carried its own little personality. She found herself quietly naming them in her thoughts. Brave. Quiet. Swift. Gentle. Little Star. Not official names. Just small pieces of affection that made the wilderness feel less lonely. After feeding them, she wrapped the pups carefully beneath her repaired cloak once again. The fabric had begun to tear along one edge after days of climbing rocks and fallen trees. Using a bone needle she had carved herself and strong pine fibers twisted into thread, she stitched the rip closed as neatly as she could. "This old cloak is working harder than either of us expected," she whispered. A tiny tail wagged beneath the wool. She resumed her journey north. The forest changed as the hours passed. The towering pines slowly gave way to ancient cedar trees whose trunks were so wide that 4 people could not have wrapped their arms around them together. Strange blue moss covered fallen stones. Crystal icicles hung from branches like rows of glass bells. Tiny birds flitted between the trees, their feathers bright against the endless white. Everything felt untouched. Older than kingdoms. Older than kings. Sometimes Elian thought she heard footsteps behind her. Whenever she turned, nothing stood there. Only snow. Only trees. Only silence. Yet the feeling never disappeared. Someone, or something, was following. She stopped beside a frozen clearing shortly after midday. Fresh tracks crossed the snow. Not deer. Not fox. Wolves. Many wolves. Large ones. Their footprints formed loose circles around the clearing before disappearing into the woods again. Elian knelt beside one print. It was enormous. far larger than any wolf she had ever seen. She gently placed her hand beside it. Her fingers barely covered half its width. They came back. The pups stirred beneath her cloak. Almost immediately distant howls rolled across the mountains. Not threatening. Not mournful. The sound rose and fell together like voices answering one another across great distances. Elian listened. A strange calm settled over her. She could not understand why. The forest suddenly felt less frightening. As though invisible eyes watched over her instead of hunting her. The peace did not last. A raven burst from the trees. Its frightened cry shattered the silence. Then another bird followed. Then dozens. They exploded upward into the sky all at once. Every instinct inside Elian tightened. Something was coming. Heavy footsteps echoed faintly through the forest. Not one person. Many. Metal clinked against metal. Branches snapped beneath boots. Voices drifted through the trees. Spread out. Search every ridge. They couldn't have gone far. Elian's heartbeat quickened. Soldiers. She pulled the pups closer beneath her cloak and hurried toward the thickest part of the forest. Snow reached nearly to her knees. Every step became harder. The voices grew louder. There! Someone had found her footprints. She looked back. Several riders appeared between the trees. Dark cloaks. Black horses. The silver hawk banner of Ashenhold fluttered behind them. At their head rode a broad-shouldered man wearing a wolf fur mantle over polished armor. A scar crossed his jaw. His cold eyes swept across the snow until they found the fresh trail. He smiled. She's close. The hunters surrounded the clearing within minutes. Elian ducked behind fallen cedar trunks, barely daring to breathe. One pup whimpered softly. She gently placed a finger against its tiny nose. Please. The little wolf fell silent. Boots crunched through the snow only a few yards away. We know you're here, one hunter shouted. You'll freeze before nightfall. Another laughed. Lord Varric wants the wolves alive. And the woman? The first hunter shrugged. Dead if necessary. Elian felt every ounce of warmth leave her body. This was no search for justice. They had come to erase her completely. Far away, inside the stone walls of Ashenhold Castle, Lord Varric stood before a blazing fireplace, warming his hands while servants quietly refilled his wine. Across the room sat King Aldric. The king stared through the tall windows toward the distant mountains hidden beneath heavy clouds. You are certain she fled north? Aldric asked. Varric nodded calmly. Our scouts confirmed it. A long silence followed. Aldric's shoulders sagged. I never wished for her death. Varric lowered his eyes respectfully. Of course not, Your Majesty. But if she truly serves Rowan. He allowed the sentence to fade unfinished. Fear completed it. The king closed his eyes. I pray I have not made a terrible mistake. Varric smiled into his cup where no one could see. You already have. Back in the forest, the trap tightened. Hunters spread through the trees, leaving almost no path for escape. Elian spotted a narrow ravine hidden beneath snow-covered rocks. It was dangerous. Steep. But it offered one chance. Holding the pups tightly beneath her cloak, she climbed down the icy slope. Loose stones slid beneath her boots. One rock gave way completely. She slipped. Her body slammed against the frozen ground. Pain shot through her shoulder. The pups cried out. She immediately wrapped herself around them before her own body struck another rock. Snow exploded around them. For several seconds she could not breathe. Slowly, she forced herself upright. Her shoulder throbbed fiercely, but when she opened the cloak, all 5 pups were unharmed. She laughed through tears. Worth it. The ravine twisted between towering walls of black stone. Above her, hunters searched the upper ridges. One looked down. There! An arrow flew. It struck the rock inches from Elian's head. Stone fragments sprayed across the snow. She ran. Every breath burned. Her boots slipped repeatedly. Another arrow buried itself in a tree ahead. The ravine narrowed. There was nowhere left to hide. Then, A howl echoed behind the hunters. Deep. Powerful. Ancient. The forest answered immediately. Another howl. Then another. Then dozens. The hunters froze. The horses reared in panic. What was that? Before anyone answered, enormous white wolves emerged silently from the trees above the ravine. 1, 3, 7. More. Their thick winter coats gleamed beneath the pale afternoon light. Their golden eyes never blinked. They did not attack. They simply stood. Watching. Waiting. The largest wolf stepped onto a high ledge overlooking the hunters. Its scarred muzzle lifted toward the sky. It released another thunderous howl that rolled through the mountains like distant thunder. The hunters' horses screamed. Several bolted. Men were thrown into the snow. Fall back. No. Drive them away. But the wolves never charged. Instead, they slowly moved along the ridges, always staying between the hunters and the fleeing woman. Wherever a soldier tried to advance, another white wolf appeared silently ahead. Watching. Blocking. Guiding. The hunters suddenly realized they were not chasing prey anymore. They were being herded. Fear spread faster than commands. One man dropped his spear. Another abandoned his horse completely. Within minutes, Lord Varric's carefully planned pursuit collapsed into confusion. Hidden below, Elian stared upward in disbelief. The wolves were protecting her. As evening approached, the ravine opened onto a narrow mountain pass where ancient stone steps climbed toward the cliffs. Half buried beneath snow stood weathered pillars carved with wolves unlike any Elian had ever seen. Their eyes had been shaped from pale crystal that still caught the fading sunlight. She climbed slowly. The air became strangely warm despite the snow. Wind no longer reached the narrow passage. Even the forest seemed unwilling to disturb this forgotten place. At the top stood an ancient shrine. Its roof had long since collapsed. Vines wrapped around broken walls. A circle of enormous stone wolves surrounded a cracked altar at the center. Each statue faced inward as though guarding a sacred promise. Elian stepped carefully across the worn stones. Strange symbols covered every surface. Not the language of Ashenhold. Not the Northern Kingdom either. Something older. She brushed snow away from the altar. Beneath centuries of dust appeared a beautifully carved image. 2 kings. Standing side by side. Between them rested the heads of 5 white wolves. Above them shone a single full moon. Words had been carved beneath the image. Time had worn many away. Only a few remained clear. Together. One oath. Until the last Moonborn. Elian whispered the words aloud. A chill, not from the cold, but from wonder, ran through her. The Moonborn. The pups stirred beneath her cloak as if they recognized the name. Then the sound of hooves echoed through the mountain pass. Not the frantic chaos of Varric's hunters. Steady. Disciplined. Dozens of riders approached. Elian turned toward the entrance. Snow drifted gently through the broken archway. Dark banners appeared first. Not the silver hawk of Ashenhold. These carried a white wolf beneath a silver moon. The riders entered slowly. At their center rode a tall man wearing a deep blue cloak lined with white fur. His calm grey eyes immediately found the bundle beneath Elian's cloak. The 5 pups peeked out. For one long, silent moment. Neither moved. Then every soldier behind him quietly lowered their weapons. The stranger dismounted without a word. And the largest white wolf stepped from the shadows to stand beside him. Elian realized, with one quiet breath. She was looking into the eyes of the rival king. The mountain wind drifted softly through the broken roof of the ancient shrine, stirring ribbons of snow across the weathered stone floor. For a long moment, no one moved. King Rowan stood only a few paces away. He was younger than the stories had made him, though years of responsibility rested quietly across his face. His cloak, woven from deep blue wool, was fastened with a simple silver clasp shaped like a crescent moon. Unlike the jeweled crowns worn by southern rulers, Rowan wore no gold upon his head. Only a narrow circlet of polished steel. It suited him. There was nothing about him that begged to be admired. Instead, everything about him invited trust. His gaze never left the bundle beneath Elian's cloak. The tiny white pups had begun to stir, sensing unfamiliar voices. One curious little nose pushed through the folds of wool. Another tiny head appeared beside it. The smallest pup yawned sleepily before blinking toward the strangers. Something remarkable happened. Every rider behind Rowan slowly lowered to one knee. Not before the king. Before the pups. Elian stared in silent surprise. Rowan finally spoke, his voice calm enough to match the quiet mountains. So they truly live. No triumph filled his words. Only relief. The kind of relief carried by someone who had feared he was already too late. He stepped closer, careful not to frighten either the woman or the tiny wolves. I searched every valley north of Frostveil. His eyes softened. I never imagined I would find them in the arms of an exile. Elian tightened her hold instinctively. The largest white wolf standing beside Rowan watched her carefully. It lowered its head, breathing in the scent of the pups. Instead of reaching for them, it gently touched its nose against Elian's hand. The gesture lasted only a heartbeat. Yet every soldier witnessed it. Several exchanged stunned glances. One elderly commander whispered almost silently, "The Guardian accepts her." Another crossed his hand over his heart. Rowan noticed both reactions. "So," he murmured, "it is true." Elian frowned. "What is true?" Before Rowan could answer, one of the pups wriggled free of the cloak. The bold little wolf stumbled across Elian's lap before tumbling into the snow. A dozen soldiers gasped. The pup looked around, entirely unimpressed by the worried humans surrounding it. Then it waddled directly toward Rowan. Elian held her breath. The king slowly knelt. He did not reach forward. He simply waited. The tiny wolf sniffed his boot. Its ears twitched. Then, without warning, it turned away. Instead, it hurried back toward Elian as quickly as its tiny legs could carry it. It climbed awkwardly into her lap before curling against her chest. Silence filled the shrine. One young rider blinked twice. "I've never seen that." The old commander nodded slowly. "Neither have I." Rowan smiled. Not with disappointment. With quiet wonder. The Moonborn choose freely. He looked toward Elian. "And today? They chose you." The journey to the Northern Kingdom began before sunset. Rather than placing Elian under guard, Rowan offered her his own horse. She hesitated. "I can walk." "You already have." He glanced toward the bloody cloth wrapped around her shoulder. "And you've walked far enough." She realized he was right. The climb through the ravine had reopened the wound from her fall. Her sleeve had darkened with dried blood. Without another word she accepted. Rowan lifted the smallest pup into the saddle before helping the others settle safely inside a basket lined with thick lamb's wool. The pups immediately began chewing on one another's ears. The soldiers laughed quietly. Even after everything that had happened, they were still only babies. The procession traveled north through hidden mountain trails invisible from the valleys below. Massive cliffs sheltered narrow paths carved centuries earlier. Frozen waterfalls glittered beside the road. Mountain goats watched from impossible heights before disappearing among the rocks. At night they camped beneath ancient pines where enormous white wolves appeared silently from the darkness. Some carried fresh rabbits. Others dragged fish from icy rivers. None came close enough to frighten Elian. Yet each morning the food waited neatly beside the campfire. She watched the wolves from a distance. "They're feeding us." Rowan nodded. "They're thanking you." "For what?" "For refusing to leave their future behind." On the fourth morning the mountains suddenly opened. Elian stopped breathing. Beyond the final ridge stretched a valley unlike anything she had imagined. A wide lake reflected the morning sky like polished silver. Fields of evergreen surrounded clusters of stone homes, whose rooftops were covered with flowering moss instead of heavy tiles. Thin columns of smoke curled peacefully from chimneys. Wooden bridges crossed bright streams where children laughed while enormous wolves rested nearby like loyal companions. No chains. No cages. No fear. Humans and wolves lived together. Not as masters. Not as pets. As neighbors. Elian whispered. "It's beautiful." Rowan looked across the valley. It was almost lost. The gates of Moonhaven opened slowly. No trumpets announced the king's return. Instead, bells chimed gently from wooden towers. Villagers gathered along the streets. Children waved. Old women smiled. Several wolves trotted happily between market stalls carrying baskets tied gently across their backs. Elian blinked. One grey wolf carefully delivered fresh bread to an elderly baker before accepting a grateful scratch behind the ears. Another walked beside a little girl carrying herbs nearly too heavy for her small arms. The kingdom breathed differently. No one hurried. No one shouted. The rhythm of life followed seasons rather than politics. It reminded Elian of stories her grandmother once told beside winter fires. Stories everyone else had forgotten. News of the rescued Moonborn pups spread quickly. People gathered respectfully as Rowan carried the basket through the village. No one tried to touch them. No one pushed closer. Instead, each person bowed quietly. One elderly woman wiped tears from her face. They survived. A blacksmith removed his cap. The forest kept its promise. Elian looked toward Rowan. They love them. They remember what they mean. What do they mean? Rowan's expression grew thoughtful. Our future. That evening Rowan led Elian into the oldest building in Moonhaven. The Hall of Seasons had stood for nearly 600 years. Its walls were built from enormous cedar logs. Lanterns glowed warmly between carved beams depicting wolves running beneath stars. At the center burned a great circular hearth whose flames reflected across polished stone. Waiting beside the fire stood an elderly woman wrapped in white robes embroidered with silver thread. Her long hair flowed almost to her waist. Despite her age, her eyes shone brighter than the fire itself. "This is Mother Sarah," Rowan said quietly, "the oldest keeper of the Moon Oath." Sarah approached slowly. Instead of greeting Rowan first, she stopped before Elian. For several long seconds she simply looked into the young woman's tired eyes. Then she gently placed one weathered hand against Elian's cheek. "You've carried sorrow farther than anyone should." Elian lowered her gaze. "I only did what anyone would have done." Sarah smiled softly. "No." She glanced toward the sleeping pups. "You did what almost no one would have done." Later that night, after Rowan had left them to rest, Sarah unfolded a faded map across a wooden table. The parchment had yellowed with age. Its edges had been repaired dozens of times. She pointed toward the southern kingdom. Long before Ashenhold and Moonhaven became enemies. Her finger slowly moved north. They were one family. Elian listened silently. The first kings stood together. They protected these mountains together. The Moonborn wolves walked openly beside both kingdoms. What happened? Sarah's eyes grew distant. Pride. She touched two faded crowns painted upon the map. When one king desired more land than honor. She traced a long crack dividing the parchment. The alliance shattered. The wolves vanished. The oath was forgotten. And the kingdoms spent generations teaching their children to fear one another. Elian remembered the carving inside the mountain shrine. The two kings. The 5 wolves. The same story. Only now it felt painfully real. So the shrine was built when peace still existed. Sarah nodded. And the Moonborn remain the living promise that peace can return. Days passed gently. Elian slowly recovered. Her shoulder healed beneath the care of Moonhaven's healers. The pups grew stronger with every sunrise. They began exploring the royal gardens, tumbling through wildflowers while butterflies drifted overhead. The smallest pup no longer struggled to keep up. It often climbed onto Elian's lap whenever she sat beneath the old willow beside the lake. The villagers laughed. It has chosen its mother. Elian always smiled. I'm only borrowing them. But secretly, her heart had already begun believing otherwise. Not everyone welcomed her. Across the royal council chamber, Lord Cedric watched quietly whenever Rowan spoke with Elian. Cedric had served 3 generations of northern rulers. His loyalty appeared unquestionable. His manners remained flawless. His words were always respectful. Yet whenever Elian entered a room, his smile arrived a moment too late. His eyes never warmed. He asked harmless questions. How many days had she traveled? Which roads had she used? Where exactly had she found the pups? Each answer disappeared behind his polite nods. No one noticed how carefully he remembered every detail. That night, long after Moonhaven had fallen asleep, Cedric entered a forgotten storage room beneath the western tower. He lit a single candle. From inside an old wooden chest, he removed parchment, ink, and a trained black raven. Working quickly, he wrote only a few lines. The exile lives. She is with Rowan. The pups survived. He tied the message carefully beneath the raven's wing. The bird fluttered once, then vanished into the darkness beyond the tower window. Far to the south, Lord Varric had been waiting for that message. And before another moon had passed, the lie that had destroyed one innocent life would begin pushing two kingdoms toward a war neither one truly wanted. Winter loosened its grip one quiet day at a time. Snow that had buried the mountain paths for months began to melt into silver streams that danced over smooth stones. Tiny green shoots pushed through the earth wherever the sunlight lingered, and the forest slowly filled with birdsong that had been absent for what felt like an endless season. Life returned to Moonhaven. So did hope. The 5 Moonborn pups had nearly doubled in size. Their oversized paws promised the giants they would someday become, though they still behaved like playful children. They chased butterflies through the royal gardens, tumbled into flower beds, and often ended their adventures asleep in a tangled heap beside Elian's chair. The smallest pup, whom she had quietly begun calling Ash, refused to spend more than a few minutes away from her. Whenever she crossed the village, Ash followed. Whenever she sat beneath the willow by the lake, Ash rested his head across her boots. Whenever she laughed, his tail beat happily against the grass. The villagers smiled each time they saw them together. They no longer called Elian the exile. To them, she had become something entirely different. The guardian. One afternoon Rowan found Elian repairing a broken wooden fence beside an elderly farmer's cottage. The king leaned against the gate, watching her patiently tie fresh willow branches into place. "You know," he said with a faint smile, "most guests don't spend their mornings fixing fences." Elian laughed softly. "I stopped feeling like a guest weeks ago." "I noticed." She brushed loose strands of hair behind her ear. "I've spent enough of my life living inside stone walls." She looked across the valley where children were racing alongside young wolves. "This place feels..." She searched for the right word. "Honest." Rowan followed her gaze. "My father used to say kingdoms survive because of their people." He smiled sadly. "I spent years believing they survived because of armies. And now..." He looked toward Ash, who had fallen asleep with his head resting on Elian's foot. "Now I think both of us were only half right." That evening Mother Sarah requested a private meeting. The old keeper stood once again before the ancient map. This time another object rested beside it. A weathered scroll wrapped in faded blue cloth. The Moon Oath. She carefully untied the ribbon. The parchment inside had become fragile with age. Silver ink still shimmered across its surface. "It names the promise made by the first kings." Elian leaned closer. The old woman read slowly. "So long as the Moonborn walk beneath the stars, neither kingdom shall raise sword against the other. Whoever protects the Moonborn shall stand beyond every crown, and no king shall command their loyalty." The room fell silent. Elian whispered, "So, the wolves belong to no kingdom?" Sarah smiled. "They never did." Far to the south, Lord Varric folded Cedric's message with quiet satisfaction. The raven perched calmly upon the windowsill while servants hurried through the corridors outside. He stepped into King Aldric's council chamber carrying an expression carefully shaped to resemble concern. The king stood over a table covered with maps. Spring had reopened the northern passes. Trade caravans would soon begin traveling again. If peace held. Varric placed the message gently before him. "Our spies have returned." Aldric read the parchment once. Then again. His face slowly darkened. "Rowan has taken her." Varric lowered his head. "So it appears." The wolves survived. Apparently. The king's hand tightened against the table. I feared this. Varric waited. Silence always did half his work. Finally Aldric spoke. If Rowan possesses both the Moonborn and one of my former nobles. He possesses leverage. The advisor nodded. And perhaps justification for war. Aldric closed his eyes. I prayed my judgment had not delivered her into enemy hands. It may already have done worse. The lie settled exactly where Varric intended. Like poison inside clean water. Within days Ashenhold's messengers rode toward neighboring lords. Blacksmiths worked through the night. Grain stores filled. Archers gathered. The kingdom prepared for war. Across the border, Rowan scouts soon carried similar news. Smoke rose from distant military camps. Bridges were fortified. Watchtowers doubled their guards. The mountains that had finally begun welcoming spring once again echoed with marching feet. Elian watched soldiers training beside Moonhaven's walls. Wooden practice swords had been replaced by sharpened steel. The laughter she had come to love grew quieter with each passing day. She found Rowan standing alone above the valley one evening. Below them, children still played beside the lake, unaware that armies were gathering beyond the mountains. They're preparing, she said quietly. He nodded. So are we. She looked at him. You don't want this. No. But wanting peace and keeping peace are rarely the same thing. The wind carried the scent of pine between them. If Aldric attacks. Rowan stopped. He did not need to finish. Thousands would die. Perhaps more. That night Elian could not sleep. She wandered through the moonlit gardens while the 5 young wolves padded silently behind her. The full moon reflected across the lake. Everything appeared peaceful. Almost painfully so. She sat beneath the old willow. Ash climbed into her lap. The others curled around her feet. She buried her fingers inside their soft white fur. You saved me. 5 pairs of golden eyes looked up at her. I think. Her voice trembled. It's my turn to save all of you. The largest of the young wolves gently rested his head against her shoulder. The decision settled quietly inside her heart. Before dawn, she already knew what she had to do. Morning sunlight had barely reached the valley when Elian entered Rowan's council chamber. Every commander rose. Maps covered the great table. Colored stones marked troop movements. The air smelled of ink, leather, and cold iron. Rowan looked up immediately. You haven't slept. No. She stepped closer. I've made my choice. The room grew still. I will go to Ashenhold. Several commanders spoke at once. Impossible. It's suicide. They'll arrest you. They may execute you before you reach the gates. Elian listened without interrupting. Then she looked directly at Rowan. If I stay. She glanced toward the maps. War begins. If I go. There is still a chance. Rowan's expression tightened. I cannot ask that of you. You didn't. I won't let you risk your life alone. She smiled gently. You didn't let me die alone either. Neither spoke for several long moments. Finally Rowan walked toward the window overlooking the valley. I have spent my entire life trying to protect this kingdom. He looked back. And now the only hope we have asks me to let her walk into the hands of those who betrayed her. Elian stepped beside him. If compassion cannot cross a battlefield. She looked toward the distant mountains. Then hatred always will. Rowan lowered his head. He understood. Because he would have done the same. The following morning Moonhaven gathered in silence. No celebration marked her departure. No music played. Only quiet footsteps echoed through the village streets. The 5 Moonborn wolves, no longer tiny pups but powerful young guardians, stood waiting beside the northern gate. They had grown astonishingly. Their shoulders reached nearly to Elian's waist. Their snow-white coats shone beneath the rising sun. Ash stood closest. He refused to leave her side even for a moment. Rowan approached carrying the same worn cloak she had wrapped around the pups on the night they met. His hands brushed the repaired stitching. You kept it. She smiled. It kept us alive. He gently placed it across her shoulders. It seems it still has work to do. Neither spoke the words both feared. Goodbye. Instead, Rowan raised his hand. The wolves lifted their heads together. Without command, without hesitation, they fell into step beside Elian. 5 white guardians. 1 woman. Walking toward an army. High above the valley, unseen by those below, a raven turned south on black wings. Its message had already reached Lord Varric. The battlefield awaited. And so did the final truth. Dawn arrived beneath a sky of pale silver. Mist drifted through the valleys where spring flowers struggled to bloom between patches of melting snow. The mountains stood silent, their jagged peaks disappearing into clouds that seemed too heavy to move. Even the birds that usually greeted the morning remained hidden among the pines, as if nature itself sensed that this would be a day remembered for generations. Elian walked alone along the ancient King's Road. 5 white wolves moved beside her without a leash, chain, or command. Months ago they had fit beneath the folds of her old wool cloak. Now they walked with quiet confidence, their broad shoulders nearly reaching her waist. Their thick coats shone like fresh snow beneath the morning light, and their golden eyes watched every movement around them. Ash never wandered more than a few steps away. Every few moments he glanced toward Elian, making certain she was still there. She smiled softly. I'm not leaving. The young wolf gently brushed against her hand before returning to his place. Behind them, hidden among the distant hills, Rowan and a handful of trusted riders watched from far enough away that neither army could accuse them of breaking the coming truce. He had promised not to interfere. It was the hardest promise he had ever made. Beyond the final ridge, the battlefield stretched across a wide green valley. Thousands of soldiers already stood in formation. Ashenhold's silver banners fluttered in the southern wind. Across the field, Moonhaven's white wolf standards rose quietly above disciplined lines of warriors. Armor reflected the morning sun until the valley glittered like a frozen river. War horns waited. Archers stood ready. Horsemen gripped their reins. One frightened command. One careless arrow. One moment of fear. And the valley would drown in blood. A murmur spread through both armies. Someone was walking between them. Alone. No shield. No weapon. Only a grey cloak and 5 enormous white wolves. Men lowered their spears. Archers slowly relaxed bowstrings. The silence spread faster than any order. King Aldric stepped forward from the southern ranks. He stared across the field. For a moment he did not recognize the woman. She looked thinner. Stronger somehow. The frightened uncertainty he remembered from the day of her exile had disappeared. She walked with calm purpose. The same cloak remained around her shoulders. Only now it seemed less like the clothing of an exile, and more like the mantle of someone who belonged to no throne. Lord Varric's face drained of color. No. He whispered. Impossible. He had expected soldiers. He had expected Rowan himself. He had even prepared for an ambush. He had never imagined Elian would walk directly into the space between 2 armies carrying nothing except truth. His eyes shifted toward the wolves. Recognition struck him immediately. The largest one bore the same silver mark upon its shoulder as the mother wolf his mercenaries had slaughtered months before. If anyone connected those wolves to the attack, everything would end. He quietly stepped backward. One hand slipped beneath his cloak toward the dagger hidden at his belt. Elian stopped exactly halfway between both kingdoms. The valley became perfectly still. Even the wind seemed unwilling to interrupt. She slowly removed the old cloak. The repaired stitching caught the sunlight. Carefully she folded it across her arms. Then she looked first toward Ashenhold. Then toward Moonhaven. Finally she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The silence carried every word. I stand here because both kingdoms have forgotten something. Her eyes settled upon King Aldric. You believed I betrayed you. Then she looked toward Rowan. You believed war was coming. She raised the cloak slightly. But neither of you was the enemy. King Aldric stepped forward. Elian. His voice carried more regret than authority. I never wished. She gently lifted one hand. He fell silent. Months earlier she would never have interrupted her king. Today she spoke not as a noble, nor as an exile, but as the guardian chosen by the Moonborn. You feared lies because someone taught you to fear. Her gaze moved slowly across the gathered nobles. Ask yourselves one question. She turned toward Varric. Who gained from this war? Every eye followed hers. The advisor remained perfectly still. Too still. Before anyone could speak, Ash growled. It was the first threatening sound anyone had ever heard from him. The young wolf stepped forward. His ears flattened. The other 4 wolves immediately formed a protective line beside Elian. Not because she commanded them. Because they sensed danger. Varric's fingers tightened around the hidden dagger. He knew he had only one chance. If Elian died now, perhaps the truth would die with her. With a sudden shout he rushed forward. Steel flashed beneath the sunlight. Several soldiers cried out. But before the blade reached Elian, Ash moved. The young wolf launched himself through the air. His powerful body struck Varric's shoulder with enough force to send both of them crashing into the grass. The dagger spun harmlessly across the field. The remaining wolves surrounded the fallen advisor. They did not bite. They did not tear. They simply stood over him. Golden eyes burning with silent warning. Varric tried to crawl away. None of them moved. He was trapped. By restraint. Not violence. Captain Rowan of Ashenhold, the same aging commander who had apologized during Elian's banishment, recognized something lying inside Varric's torn cloak. Several folded letters spilled across the ground. Wax seals. Maps. Payment records. He picked one up. Then another. His weathered face slowly hardened. Your Majesty. He carried them toward King Aldric. You should read these. The king broke the first seal. His hands began to shake. Inside were orders bearing Varric's private mark. Payments made to mercenaries. Instructions to attack the Moonborn den. False reports planted among royal messengers. Forged letters supposedly written by Elian. Every lie. Every betrayal. Every death. Written in Varric's own hand. Silence crushed the battlefield. Aldric looked toward the advisor. You. His voice broke. You murdered your own people. Varric laughed weakly. They were necessary. You started this war. For peace. Varric smiled bitterly. No. For power. The confession echoed across the valley. No one spoke. No one defended him. At last the mask he had worn for years had fallen away. King Aldric slowly removed his crown. The simple movement shocked every noble present. He walked alone across the battlefield until he stood before Elian. Then, to the astonishment of both kingdoms, he knelt. Not as a defeated king. As a man asking forgiveness. I judged an innocent woman. His voice trembled. I listened to fear instead of truth. He lowered his head. I cannot return what I took from you. The valley remained silent. I can only confess my failure before every soul gathered here. Elian looked at the man who had once sent her into the wilderness with nothing. She remembered the cold. The hunger. The endless snow. She remembered wrapping 5 tiny lives inside the only cloak she had left. Hatred would have been easy. But hatred had already nearly destroyed 2 kingdoms. She reached forward. Not to lift his crown. Not to reclaim her title. Only to help him stand. The past cannot be changed. Her voice remained gentle. But tomorrow still can. Tears filled many eyes across the battlefield. Even hardened soldiers quietly looked away. Mother Sarah arrived carrying the ancient moon oath. She stood upon a great stone between both armies. The old parchment fluttered gently in the spring breeze. Her clear voice carried across the valley. The first kings promised that whoever protected the Moonborn would stand beyond every throne. She looked toward Elian. The oath remembers. Then toward both rulers. Do you? Rowan stepped forward first. Without hesitation he placed one hand upon the ancient scroll. I remember. Aldric followed. His voice came quietly. So do I. Together they repeated the forgotten vow spoken by their ancestors centuries before. Neither kingdom would again raise arms against the other while the Moonborn walked beneath the stars. When the final words faded, something extraordinary happened. A long howl rose from the surrounding forests. Then another. Then dozens more. Hundreds of wolves emerged from the trees surrounding the valley. Grey wolves. Black wolves. Silver wolves. White wolves. Old wolves. Young wolves. None showed aggression. They simply gathered. Watching. Witnessing. As though nature itself had accepted the promise. Varric was taken away in chains. Not one soldier protested. Justice required no celebration. Only truth. Weeks later, life settled into a new rhythm. Trade roads reopened. Bridges once guarded by soldiers welcomed merchants instead. Children from both kingdoms played together during spring festivals. The old stories slowly returned. Not tales of enemies, but tales of shared beginnings. King Aldric offered Elian everything he had once taken. Her title. Her lands. A place beside his court. She listened quietly, then smiled. I've already found my home. The mountain sanctuary where she had first discovered the ancient shrine became a place of peace. Travelers from both kingdoms climbed its stone steps to leave flowers beside the carved wolves. The broken roof was rebuilt. The faded carvings carefully restored. Nearby, a simple cottage overlooked the valley. Its garden overflowed with healing herbs, wild roses, and young pine trees. That became Elian's home. Not a palace. Not a castle. A place where the wind carried birdsong instead of whispered lies. The 5 Moonborn wolves never wandered far. They had grown into magnificent guardians. Their names became known throughout both kingdoms. Brave, Swift, Gentle, Star, and Ash. Ash remained closest to Elian. Every evening he rested beneath the old willow outside her cottage while she read beside the fading light. Visitors often asked why such powerful wolves obeyed her so completely. She always smiled. They don't. She scratched behind Ash's ears. We simply chose one another. Years passed. Children who had never known war grew into adults who crossed the mountains without fear. Merchants no longer counted kingdoms. Only destinations. The Moonborn wolves became living symbols of unity instead of division. And whenever winter returned, covering the forests in white once more, parents gathered their children close beside warm fires and told them a story. Not about the greatest king. Not about the strongest warrior. But about a woman who lost everything except an old wool cloak. And chose kindness anyway. They spoke of the 5 tiny wolf pups she carried beneath that cloak through snow and hunger. They spoke of the wolves who answered compassion with loyalty. They spoke of 2 kingdoms saved not by swords, but by one gentle heart that refused to let innocence die. And long after crowns had been passed to new rulers, long after the names of many nobles had faded into dust, the people still remembered Lady Elian. Because true legends are never written by power. They are written by mercy. And in the quiet mountains where wolves still howled beneath the full moon, the old promise lived on. As long as kindness found the courage to walk into the cold, hope would never walk alone.